Thanks very much, Dan, for that very generous introduction. And thank you to all of you for coming tonight. I'm sorry to any of you who are getting bad angles here. Feel free to move closer in if you want a better view of Nick. And just to say thank you so much for coming. It's a choice that you've made to spend some money on a Tuesday night to support a Sydney-based author, a Sydney bookstore, publishing houses that are facing very challenging times. I love events like this, and I think it's a huge part of any good, thriving community to have events like this on a midweek night or a Tuesday night. And so to all of you that have taken the time to do this, thank you very much. I swore about Nick Bryant on Friday morning. I just finished swimming some laps early in the morning, and I'd seen Nick at work at RN during the week, and we were sort of chit-chatting about his book launch. He was going on Q&A. He wanted some sort of advice, and we were sort of talking about the well-timed book, and he was doing Saturday Extra. And I thought, oh, that's pretty good. And he said, we might get a verdict like while we're on air on Saturday morning. I thought, thank God I don't have to think about any of this. Geraldine and I are doing a great episode on the UK election. It's going to be wonderful, and I can not think about Trump for a few more days. And then I got out of the pool and my phone was exploding and all this Trump stuff, and I thought, that fucking Nick Bryant.
Got it wrong again.
Bloody timed his book perfectly. You don't need me to tell you that the Trump story has the ability to suck the oxygen out of the American story, the global story in many ways. But maybe there is something bigger and broader that we need to be thinking about, and a wider lens that we can apply to considering what's unfolding in America today. And I think that question is something that Nick Bryant is uniquely placed to be able to explore. As mentioned, he's had this lifelong fascination with the United States. And actually, in reading the book, I learned just how young and early that began. It wasn't just the sort of doctorate at Oxford. He's been North America correspondent for the BBC, among other things. And I think what does really stand out is that Nick hasn't just covered the politics of America. He's sort of covered the full sweep, the full kaleidoscope of weirdness that comes out of America, but you deliver it all with that sort of beautiful tone and style that you do everything. And I think for someone who's worked so thoroughly in the trench system of the news cycle, what stands out about Nick's observations is that they're always so clear-eyed, they're contextual, and they illuminate the story and the issues in ways that I think most of us journalists really struggle to achieve. I'm not alone in thinking that. I noticed at the back of this book, in the About the Author section, it says that one of his previous books, When America Stopped Being Great, is kept by Biden inside the White House. So we might find out about that. His new book is called The Forever War, America's Unending Conflict with Itself. Would you please put your hands together for Nick Bryant?
Can I just say thank you? Look, can I just add to what Hamish said? I'm blown away.
You need to turn it on.
Oh,
I literally said to Dan when he gave us the instructions to turn it on that I bet you one of us will forget.
And I said to Dan, don't worry, we're two old pros. We know what we're doing with a couple of microphones. I got that totally wrong. Look, I just want to say thank you for coming out. I'm blown away by how many people have come out tonight, and thank you so much. I did Q&A last night, and I came away thinking, I wonder how they can revamp the format, and here we are. I think they should just hold Q&A in this brewery every Monday night. I think that would be absolutely brilliant. Dan, thank you, Roaring Stories. It's great that bookstores are doing events like this. It is fantastic. Thank you very much. Hamish as well. I first came across Hamish about 15 years ago. It was a Walkley's Young Journalist of the Year. They showed this sizzle reel of this buccaneering young debonair correspondent. And I thought, wow, this guy's good. He's going places. And he really has gone places. He's one of the great correspondents, not just in Australia, but one of the great correspondents in the world. And you should be very proud of what Hamish has achieved. Absolutely brilliant. Thank you, my friend, for hosting tonight. And I'll let you...
Thanks for taking that G up from Mum. That was very generous. Timing is everything. I mean, you would have known, that we're on the way to an election and there'd be stuff in the news cycle. But I mean, just putting a book out like right now, it's pretty remarkable how prescient everything in it feels.
Well, the bizarre thing about Friday morning when the verdict came out was that we actually got to watch the forever war, America's unending conflict with itself, play out on the screens. I could watch it from my sofa in Sydney by flicking between MSNBC and Fox News. It was as if they were covering two different trials, wasn't it? For MSNBC, of course, this was justice done. This was a criminal president whose criminality had been exposed in court, and a jury had agreed that he was guilty, 34 times guilty. And of course, if you switched over to Fox News, it was this travesty of justice, a witch hunt, that they had gone after Donald Trump, and they'd ensnared him in this political trap, a Democratic jury in a Democratic city, in a Democratic state, with a Democratic judge, with a Democratic prosecutor. I'm sure there are more Democrats that Fox News mentioned that morning. And there, bang, there's the forever war. There's America's unending conflict with itself. Because division in America, which has always been the default, division in America has reached the point now where there are totally two different realities. And that is a huge problem for the country. And what was sort of shocking to me was not the verdict. It wasn't shocking, actually.
Were you not shocked by that? I was a bit shocked.
You thought they would be...
I didn't expect 34 counts guilty.
Well, once you got one count guilty, you kind of thought they were going to knock over the whole domino set. It was just going to be guilty, 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 which is essentially what happened. And I mean, bearing in mind, this was the weakest case. This was the weakest criminal case that was mounted against Donald Trump. It relied on a kind of novel legal theory. There might be some grounds for appeal there. Normally a kind of falsification of business records would be a misdemeanor. To elevate it to a felony, you need to prove there was another crime committed as well. That's where they brought in this idea of an election conspiracy, and that's slightly tricky. It brings into play federal law in a state case, blah, blah, blah. So there is some legal complexity there. But, it's quite hard to get a unanimous verdict, even amongst the New York jury, and this was the weakest case. I think what was disappointing but unsurprising was the reaction of the Republican Party. This could have been a moment when they repudiated Donald Trump. We can't have a convicted felon leading us into the election as our presidential nominee. But rather like January the 6th, it became a moment of Republican radicalization, a moment when the party rallied around Donald Trump rather than rejected Donald Trump. So the forever war goes on.
There's a point in the book, it's sort of later on, where you're talking about when Trump was arraigned, and you describe the media going into full white Bronco mode. And you're talking about the O.J. Simpson, the famous kind of the slow motion thing.
The slow motion car chase, yeah.
But you talk earlier in the book as well about these sort of episodes in America's more recent history, things like the Florida recount, the hanging chads, the Clinton impeachment, and then the O.J. Simpson trial. And you describe them as a national melodrama that with neatly episodic cliffhangers. And I'm just wondering whether actually, we're all now talking about what's going on with Trump and the guilty verdict as this huge, unbelievable, unprecedented thing. But actually, is this just another one of those things?
Yeah, I mean, that's the argument of the book, really, that this is... the cliche about Trump is that he's a president like no other. And, no president has kind of said to his supporters after an election, let's storm the Capitol. So there are clearly things that Donald Trump has done which are unprecedented. But, he's the first president to be a convicted felon. But Richard Nixon would have been a convicted felon had it not been for the pardon from Gerald Ford. Nixon committed so many crimes during Watergate. It was a slam dunk of a case. He would have been prosecuted if they decided to do that. But instead, Gerald Ford decided to pardon him. We think about Donald Trump's demagoguery. Well, demagogues have raised their heads throughout American history. We think about the authoritarian tendencies of Donald Trump. We think of that as something new, and it really isn't. A lot of presidents, going back right to the beginning, John Adams, the second president, literally tried to ban the opposition, literally tried to make it a criminal offense to criticize the president. Even some of the heroes of the American story, like Abraham Lincoln, he suspended habeas corpus. He shut down 300 newspapers that he didn't like. And that was a clear violation of the First Amendment. FDR, one of the great liberal heroes, he tried to pack the Supreme Court because he thought the Supreme Court was an obstacle in the way of him. He busted the norm that was set by George Washington to serve 2 terms in the White House. He just kept on running again and again. But the key thing is that FDR got re-elected because the Americans liked that style of government. They liked a strongman president. They liked a strong executive leader. And Eleanor Roosevelt always said that the biggest applause line in his 1933 inaugural address was not the famous phrase, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." It was actually when FDR said, "You realize I might have to alter the balance of the Constitution here. We are facing such a crisis. I might have to adopt wartime powers in peacetime." And that apparently was the line that got the big applause. So it shows that America has always been open to the idea of a very strong president, and Trump's enduring popularity shows that.
And you sort of contrast it in the book with the example of someone like Harry Truman, who was not seen in that way. Biden clearly is not seen as strong. What is it that America is uncomfortable about with someone that isn't the alpha daddy?
Yeah, I mean, a lot of presidents who are perceived to be weak and frail only serve 1 term. The classic example is Jimmy Carter. Another example is George Herbert Walker Bush. Newsweek used to speak about the wimp factor with George Herbert Walker Bush, which is incredibly unfair. I mean, this guy was a war hero. At a tender age, he was flying combat missions over the Pacific and actually got shot down. I mean, that to me isn't a wimp factor. Yeah. But he was seen after the Reagan years, especially, as not somebody who was particularly dynamic or charismatic, and that counted against him. And I think that's a problem for Biden now. Biden is obviously seen as weak and frail because of his old age, because of the stutter, because of the way that some of his speeches sort of turn into these kind of rambling soliloquies. It's a real problem for Biden, yeah.
The perception of weakness?
The perception of weakness.
But isn't he also quite weak?
Oh, look, I think if Biden was a 65-year-old, he would have a really strong record to run on. And he's done some quite extraordinary things, I think. He got the American economy back on track after COVID, after the kind of carnage, really, of the Trump administration in its handling of the pandemic. Quickly they got things sort of sorted out. He's managed to get some significant legislation through on infrastructure, there's been some bipartisanship that he's managed to negotiate on China and things like that. There have been some setbacks in Afghanistan, clearly, but, Biden's mobilization of the West during Ukraine was very significant, a significant moment in history. Trump would have let Putin drive all the way to Kyiv. Biden actually mobilized the West and helped shore up the Ukrainian government. So it's a really significant record of accomplishment that he can run on. But, the problem for Biden, obviously, is the age issue, by definition, gets worse every single day. Every single day in the White House, he sets a new record. And you'll remember Reagan, back in 84, used that devastating line when he was confronted by the age issue. "I'm not going to take political advantage of the youth and experience of my rival." Brilliant line. Mondale in that moment, Walter Mondale realized he'd lost the election in that moment. That line is just unavailable to Joe Biden. And, a crucial difference. Reagan was 73 when he said that. Biden obviously is 81. And those 8 years make a big difference.
There's obviously the characters that we all know about. You introduced me to some names I hadn't heard of before. But what stood out to me, and I'm sure that's why you've included them, is that they feel so contemporary. There's a Catholic priest, Father Charles Coughlin.
Yeah.
Who had a radio show, and a governor of Louisiana called Huey Long, who was known as Kingfish. Now, I feel like if they were around today, they might have been on Fox, but probably sacked, and might now be on Newsmax or sort of Twitter. Who were they, and what was their caper, and what do they tell us about the kind of argument you're making about the longer arc of this?
Well, these were demagogues that emerged in the 1930s. I mean, the 1930s were a kind of age of demagoguery in Europe, and America had its demagogues as well. Charles Coughlin was a Catholic priest from Michigan. They used to call his church the Shrine of the Little Fuhrer, because he was a Nazi sympathizer. He was horribly anti-Semitic. He had this radio show that had this huge, huge following, and he used to spew pretty much Nazi propaganda. In fact, his demise came when they actually realized he was plagiarizing Nazi propaganda from Goebbels. I mean, literally word for word. And that's what eventually undid him. Huey Long was the governor of Louisiana, called Kingfish, as you say, corrupt, a strongman leader in Louisiana who had a national following. Both of them harnessed the power of radio. And what's interesting about both of them, actually, is they demonstrated not just the appeal of demagogues in America, but how demagogues can actually infiltrate the mainstream. If you look at the New Deal and FDR and this great liberal hero, the early part of the New Deal was seen as too Wall Street friendly. And this was one of the populist claims of these guys, Coughlin and Huey Long, that his policies were geared towards a financial elite rather than the people. And it was because of the way that they mobilized opinion against FDR that there was what was called the Second New Deal, which became far more liberal, far more focused on, poor people, blue-collar workers, all of those things. McCarthy was the same in the 1950s. He ended up having, again, another demagogic figure who harnessed the power, this time of television. He ended up having a pretty big input on policy as well, certainly in the foreign policy era. It was very tough for any president to be soft on communism after McCarthy came along. He was a friend of the Kennedy family. Jack Kennedy, John F. Kennedy, loved McCarthy. He went out with his sister. The point of all that is to show not only that Americans are receptive to demagogues and strongmen, but these demagogues and strongmen over the course of American history have had huge influence, and they've had huge influence in the mainstream. So again, when Trump comes along, we shouldn't be that surprised.
I don't know if you're seeing it, but there's a note telling you to please hold the microphone closer to your mouth.
Oh. Sorry, my boomy voice generally doesn't need a microphone. Oh, there we go. There's a bit of clapping at the back. No, the BBC, they said, literally, I just had to open the windows and point in the direction of London and they would hear me. There was no need for a sort of satellite or anything. But my apologies if you missed all the beginning of that. Anyway.
Is that why you kept getting posted to America? It reduced the satellite feed.
Exactly. I just sort of project my voice across the Atlantic, yeah.
I just want to get some of your sort of personal interest in this, because I think you're unlike a lot of foreign correspondents that end up in these places. It wasn't just by chance. You have had this kind of lifelong fascination. And actually you tell a story about it as a 16-year-old seeing a film called American Journey. Now, I don't know whether you had these observations about it at the time, but you sort of talk about it as blurring history with folklore, and I guess this goes to the power of demagogues and others. But, what were you picking up on as a 16-year-old? What was it that was grabbing you? Did you have, I guess, the kernel of these insights?
Look, my formative experience in America was to travel there as a 16-year-old on the eve of the Los Angeles Olympics, which was just this extraordinary time in American history. They had had this long national nightmare of Vietnam and Watergate and the Iranian hostage crisis and stagflation and all of these kind of things. And then the LA Olympics came along and America got its mojo back. And Ronald Reagan perfectly encapsulated the mood of the times with the ringing slogan, "It's morning again in America." And I witnessed all this. It was an extraordinary time to be there. You remember the Soviet boycott meant that the American team had this gold rush. 1984 was when the chant USA, USA first was voiced, and it swept from shore to shore.
Were you sucked in by it, though?
Totally.
Because I
loved it.
Having lived and worked in the UK, it really strikes me that Brits sort of admire, almost envy Americans in a way that I don't think we're quite the same. It's like you all kind of somehow imagine this version of yourselves in a convertible driving through California.
I went there because my dad's best man had emigrated from Britain to America. He lived in this kind of amazing house with a 3-car garage. Wow. He had a swimming pool in the back garden. He used to drive to work on a Harley Davidson. He was in the aeronautics business. He was kind of in the business of inventing the American future. And it was an extraordinary thing to witness, and it changed me. I mean, my mum and dad always say I came back far more confident. I always felt the kind of oppression of class in Britain. I always felt that a lot of the mates that I was with at my school, my state school in Bristol, where I grew up, was, too many people were reconciled to their fate at too early an age. And I went to America, and it was full of dreamers. It was full of people who believed they could do anything. And I came back from America and, you know, frankly, I started to apply for universities. Nice of you to mention where I went, but I wouldn't have gone for those universities had it not been for that experience in America. So I was totally sucked in, and I really came to believe in the idea of the American dream. And kind of what I talk about in the book is that, you know, one of the reasons why I think Trump was so shocking was because he challenged those myths. You know, when Trump said the American dream is dead, so many people believed him. If you're if you're living in the Rust Belt and you've heard Bill Clinton talk about building a bridge to the 21st century, well, if you're in the Rust Belt, that bridge to the 21st century felt like a bypass. It felt like it had bypassed your post-industrial community. And when Trump said that, it really resonated. Now, you know, going back to the film you mentioned, well, that was at Disneyland. It was this American Journeys film. It was actually a bit of Cold War propaganda that Walt Disney actually produced. It was an amazing telling of the American story, the grand narrative of American history, which is this continual progress and advancement. They literally dealt with the Civil War in the space of 4 words. Things weren't always good. And that was it. That was the Civil War dealt with. And it was so rousing. It was in this kind of amphitheater with these screens surrounding you. It's this, you know, you can imagine the kind of soundtrack. It was kind of Aaron Copland meets John Williams. There was this beautiful caramel voice of the guy that was commentating. It started off with a wagon trail through the Rockies. And, you know, soon you were transported to New York Harbor, the gateway for so many American stories. And I was completely sucked in, but it was a Mickey Mouse version of American history. It was American history with a happy beginning, a happy middle, and a happy end. And the argument of the book is that that grand narrative of American history of continual progress and continual advancement is false. And Trump proves that, because it was really tempting after seeing a black man get elected to the White House. You thought, well, the next bit of progress will be a woman will be elected to the White House, and Barack Obama will be followed into power by Hillary Clinton. And of course, that didn't happen. Instead, we got a racist misogynist who felt like a throwback. And it wasn't progress and advancement. It was what American history has been throughout, which is progress often followed by big setbacks.
But if he was revealing the falsehood in that, isn't he also promising that by saying he'll make America great again? Isn't he selling exactly the same dream?
Look, the genius of Make America Great Again was Trump never specified when America was great. And it's absolute genius, because then people can conjure in their minds their own kingdoms in their mind, their own halcyon days. You know, for some people it was in the 1980s when Reagan was president, you know, the morning in America. For some people it was the early 1970s before automation had really kicked in and really sort of decimated blue-collar jobs. You know, Trump blamed the decimation of blue-collar jobs in the Rust Belt on China and immigrants. But it was automation that killed off 75% of those jobs. For some people it was the 1950s, you know, the great heyday of America. And some people like the 1950s because feminism hadn't kicked in and the civil rights movement hadn't yet achieved the legislative achievements that would kill off segregation in the South and bring about universal suffrage. So he invited people basically to come up with America that kind of comported with the America that they liked. And for many people, it was a kind of America where women didn't have many rights, where African Americans didn't have any rights. It's not true of all of Trump's supporters, but it's true of a lot of them.
I think it's maybe worth touching on American exceptionalism, because you dedicate, you know, fair chunks of the book to that concept. And, you know, it's interesting, you sort of lay out the various versions of it that have been presented by different presidents. Woodrow Wilson talked about making the world safe for democracy. FDR talked about America as arsenal for democracy. Kennedy, of course, city upon a hill. Maybe if we just sort of go back to the pre-Trump bit, how would you have described America's perception of its own exceptionalism at that point? And I just wonder if we can then contrast it with now.
Well, when Obama was elected, it was this moment when you thought, wow, the original sin of slavery has finally been absolved. A black man is occupying a White House built by the enslaved. I was there that night. It was an extraordinary moment in history. I was in Washington, D.C., and African Americans in what is a predominantly African American city just converged on the White House in joyous celebration. This almost felt like an end of history moment for America. Our history is finally resolved. It was so tempting to see in Obama's victory that America had finally overcome its historical division. And the division was always about slavery. The division was always about segregation. Race has always been the most volatile fault line. And of course, that just didn't happen. There were some people who hated the idea of a black man in the White House. And they turned to the guy who negated the very idea of a legitimate black presidency. And that was Donald Trump as the leader of the birther movement. And I think in terms of perceptions about America, clearly there is a Trump effect. A lot of us around the world look at the election of Trump and we go, oh my God, what have they done? I remember the front page of the Daily Mirror, a tabloid in Britain. It had the Statue of Liberty, literally with her face in her hands, going, what have we done? But I also think there was an Obama effect that has actually ended up tarnishing America's reputation internationally. Because if somebody with the gifts of Obama, somebody with the eloquence of expression, somebody with the personal story of Obama, remember when he first emerged on the scene in 2004, he gave that extraordinary speech where he said, we don't want a red America, we don't want a blue America, we want a United States of America. And his personal story personified that. The son of a woman from Kansas, the son of an immigrant from Kenya. Obama kind of personified what America could be. But the fact that somebody with his political gifts and his oratorical gifts could not bring the nation together, indeed, arguably it racialized America even further, I think also had a big effect. So we talk about a Trump effect, but I talk in the book also about, sadly, alas, an Obama effect.
So I do want to just kind of throw it forward to what might happen in November. So I imagine it will be on everyone's minds, and I know you'll all have some questions. We'll get to those soon, so please get yourself ready. I'm sure Nick said enough to get you all thinking. If it is Trump, where does that take America next?
Well, I really fear for the future of democracy.
Do you genuinely?
I really do.
So there are.
This isn't hyperbole.
Yeah.
We've seen what he could do in the first term after he lost the election in inciting a crowd to literally go and ransack the Capitol. And what's alarming about January the 6th is not only the insurrectionists that answered the call of Trump to march on Capitol Hill, it was the fact that almost 150 Republican lawmakers went back into that building after running for their lives and voted to overturn and challenge the election. That's really, really super frightening. The attack on democracy continued. He showed worryingly authoritarian tendencies in his first term, trashing the judiciary, trying to override Congress, trying to attack the freedoms of the press, demonizing the press, talking about having moats along the southern border that were filled with alligators and poisonous snakes. Literally. He didn't only want to build a wall. At one stage, he wanted to build a moat that was full of alligators. They actually had to cost this out in the White House. Alarming stuff like this. Ahead of his first inauguration, he said, let's make it like North Korea. Let's have tanks and choppers rather than high school bands. And what constrained Trump, of course, was there were grown-ups in the room that either said, Donald, you can't do that, or just ignored it when he said, would you do it? And the problem with the second term is he knows now how Washington will work. He won't appoint the sort of moderating influences that were there the last time. And all you've got to listen to realize the danger that Trump poses is the people who work with him in the first term. They are sounding the alarm. And these aren't kind of MSNBC liberals. These are Fox News Republicans who are saying this guy really does pose a threat. I really do believe it's code red for democracy. I really worry about the way this election's being framed. You know, what a terrible choice. This kind of dodgy 81-year-old, this kind of crazy Trump. Because the choice is quite stark. It's a choice between democracy and a choice between somebody who does not believe in democracy, backed now by a party that doesn't believe in democracy. And that's a terrifying prospect.
If that's true, can you help us understand why so many Americans might be willing to vote for that, if not a majority?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, if you want to poke an eye in the eye of if you want to poke a stick in the eye of the cultural elites, vote for Trump. If you are worried that America is becoming less religious and more secular, vote for Trump. If you are worried about America becoming a minority nation, which it will become by mid-century, vote for Trump. A lot of Trump supporters see themselves as casualties of the American future. It's a future where America is more secular. It's a future where America is more multicultural. It's a future where women have more rights. And a lot of people who are voting for Trump reject that future. And that is why his nostalgic nationalism has so much appeal. They want America to go back to what they believe it was. They want their halcyon day, their kingdom of the mind. They don't want to confront the future. And Trump sort of is a way of sort of protecting them from what's coming.
I wonder if you can offer everyone here something a little extra, because everyone's going to go and buy the book at the end of this. Who's got the book? Okay.
Oh, well, thank you very much.
Okay, so who's going to buy the book at the end of this?
Oh, even better. Oh,
we need a few more hands. Now, I'm going to check back again in a few minutes' time. Let's see more hands.
Try and nudge you over the line.
Exactly. We've got to help Dan out. What's it like covering America? Like, I always think Americans are the most natural and gifted vox poppers in the world.
Oh my God.
You can walk up to anyone with a microphone.
Unbelievable.
And they'll give you 10 seconds of perfection.
It's like they came out of the womb with a microphone in their hand. It's just extraordinary. I call America the land of vox. It's just the best place. Like Hamish says, you just stick a microphone in front of people and boom. First, in Britain, it's very different. I'll tell you what, the next in my kind of global ranking.
In Britain, they tell you to fuck off when you ask them for a vox pop.
Yeah, but my second in the global ranking of vox pops is actually Australia. I think Australia, there's a brilliant you're great storytellers here, and I think, you've got this wonderful expressions.
Because we do the things that Brits expect us to do on camera, is that what?
Well, look, I mean, I was the guy that always came to Australia determined to challenge the stereotypes about Australia, and in my first week here, Steve Irwin was killed, and I found myself dealing with all of those stereotypes in one human. But the thing about... You wrote
an obituary from the Crocosseum. Is that what?
Do you know, my first assignment in Australia was at the Crocosseum for Steve Irwin's memorial service, and it was absolutely a brilliant introduction to Australia because I got to meet the Wiggles, for instance. I mean, I think any foreign correspondent coming to Australia should meet the Wiggles early on, and it was an extraordinary day. And at the end of this service, they actually had all these sort of bowls of wattle, and they put them down on the floor, and then this boom camera sort of came up and it read "Crikey." And what was interesting about the Irwin story was, I mean, I went up there to Australia Zoo and I thought, oh my goodness, I'm sort of covering the cliches that I kind of didn't really want to cover. But then Irwin's dead body became this proxy battleground for the culture wars of Australia. So there were these people who thought that Steve Irwin perfectly personified Australia, right? He is the manifestation. He is Australia made flesh and blood. And that was the kind of conservative view. And then there was this liberal view, which is Steve Irwin's a bit of a national embarrassment. So immediately I was introduced to the culture wars of Australia through the death of Steve Irwin. And it was actually a really interesting formative experience.
As a journalist, it's often very easy to get lured into telling stories through the stereotypes, and I imagine particularly with America, how do you push beyond that? How do you check yourself that you're not doing that? It's pretty easy to tell the stories just with clips from Fox News and MSNBC and...
Yeah, I mean, let's let's give people the secrets of our trade. I mean, you go to an American rally,
Not too many.
you see somebody with a ridiculous hat, right? And that's the person you target straight away, because people with ridiculous hats usually say ridiculous things, right? And you kind of want that. So, but I always tried to get away from that. I always thought what struck me about the Trump rallies was not the kind of blue-collar workers that you expected to find there. It was the kind of middle class, educated, obviously affluent people. I used to watch these mums coming with their young daughters. They'd be sipping their lattes. They'd be wearing Lululemon leggings. Now, that was something I didn't necessarily expect to see at a Trump rally. And then you kind of think, well, there's some really highly intelligent people voting for Donald Trump. Why are they doing it? And there's some very highly intelligent people voting for him again. Why are they doing it? I mean, those are the questions that journalists have to ask. It was so easy to stereotype Trump supporters, and you got part of the story, but you missed a big part of the story as well, which explained his appeal and explained why he managed to win. You know, these days I tend to avoid the people with the silly hats, but one of my BBC colleagues, this came back to haunt him, because during that phase when Trump was challenging the election and a lot of crowds were converging on counting stations in places like Arizona, my BBC colleague saw this guy who was wearing bison skins, and he had this kind of Viking helmet on, and he had all these tattoos all over him, and he thought, do you know what, that guy's just too crazy to go and interview. I'm not going to give him airtime at the BBC. And the next time he saw him was on January the 6th, and it was the QAnon shaman. And of course he became the star, the kind of poster boy of January the 6th. Oh my God, I missed my chance to interview him 3 weeks ago.
Make sure you get the guy with the hat.
Yeah, Viking helmet is definitely what you want to go for.
This is possibly unfair because I don't know how much you know about this, but we often talk, we talk obsessively in Australia about AUKUS and Australia, UK, the United States, this important alliance. But there's another sort of alliance that's emerging between these three countries. And I'm talking about Donald Trump, Nigel Farage from the United Kingdom, the Brexit sort of campaigner and leader, and the former star of Neighbours, Holly Valance.
Oh, I thought you were going to say Scott Morrison.
No. But so she's married to Nick Candy, a British billionaire Tory party donor, and has become this new darling of the hard right in the UK, all the way from Ramsay Street. Do you see kind of connecting threads and lines between what's going on in Western democracies beyond what you're talking? It's sort of a cheeky reference, really. But
I love that question because it really terrifies me. You know, Scott Morrison appeared before those gold doors in Trump Tower that look like the Ark of the Covenant, don't they? I mean, it's extraordinary. And he spoke of the pylon. You know, he was referring to 4 criminal prosecutions. You know, the one that he's convicted for was actually the lesser of those charges. The other 3 are really, really important. And Scott Morrison described them as a pylon. Boris Johnson, the former British Prime Minister, basically parroted and ventriloquized the Fox News line that this was a rigged trial. You know, he wrote that in Britain over the weekend. And that really worries me, that leaders of these recent leaders of these mature democracies are kind of becoming Trump impersonators. What terrified me when I came back to Australia was to be in quarantine in the Sydney CBD for 2 weeks. And on the first Saturday morning, I heard this roar of a crowd from down below. And it was an anti-lockdown protest. And then I watched the television later, and a lot of the protesters were carrying Trump signs. And I thought, oh my God, you know, this is what I left behind. And then you see the scenes in Melbourne where they're parading a gallows through the streets against dictator Dan, in the same way that the January 6th insurrectionists tried to target Mike Pence. And then you see people urinating on the Shrine of Remembrance in Melbourne, which is another way of mimicking what happened on January the 6th. At that time, a lot of the American hard right and far right were really slamming what was happening with the Australian lockdowns. Ted Cruz, the Texas senator, said, I'm really disappointed in Australia because I always regarded Australia as the Texas of the Pacific. Governor Ron DeSantis of Florida actually said that America should sever diplomatic ties with Australia. There was this crazy woman on American talkback TV who was actually saying US Marines should invade the country to liberate Australians from these lockdowns. Tucker Carlson said, isn't it a shame that Australians don't have the right to bear arms anymore? Because if they did, they could actually mount a revolution. And at that time, Donald Trump Jr. put out a tweet saying, "Don't Australia my America." And I remember thinking at the time, don't America my Australia. We've got to protect ourselves against Americanization. You know, America used to be the beacon of democracy, and now it's a super spreader of democratic dysfunction. And it really worries me.
I think it might be time for your questions. There's a hand up at the back. Dan's going to sort out the microphone. Do you want people to come forward? Is that easier? Dan's going to take it around. So I think, there we go. So the first time up was that one at the back. If you can please just tell us your name and keep it pretty brief, if that's okay.
Hi, I'm Trace, big fan of both of you. I read a few years ago that America potentially by 2030 will not be the America we know, it will be disintegrated. Just wonder what your thoughts are as to whether, as you referred, Obama led to Trump, whether that could lead to America being disunited states.
I have to repeat this for the live stream. So I think the audience member read something about America disintegrating by 2030, and might that lead to a disunited states?
Yeah, thanks for the question, Therese. Look, America has been disunited for a long time now. You know, if you actually go back to the roots of America, you know, victory over the British brought about independence, but it didn't bring about instant nationhood. I think that's often forgotten about the American story. There was a fear that America might even form 3 or 4 confederations, that they might not become the United States of America. The plural there was significant. It wasn't called the United States of America. You know, we talk about American exceptionalism, but in the early days it was Virginian exceptionalism and Massachusetts exceptionalism. Division has always been the default. I kind of think you're asking the Civil War question. Is America heading towards civil war? And actually, pessimistic though I am about America, I'm actually less pessimistic about this than a lot of other people. There isn't the geographic divide that there was in the 1860s. There isn't the single issue divide. You know, there's a swathe of issues that divides America now. After January the 6th, a lot of the militia groups have been decapitated. Their leadership is now in prison, which is a very positive development. You know, we talk about red and blue America, but within those red states, there are big blue blobs. You know, look at Texas, you know, Houston, Austin, San Antonio, Dallas. 3 out of 4 of those have got Democratic mayors. The other one's an independent. You know, no Republicans control those cities. So it's not the kind of stark geographic divide. And, you know, America has a lot of muscle memory when it comes to dealing with its divisions. It's got a lot of experience in kind of avoiding civil war. But even though I don't think America is necessarily going to descend into civil war, I can't see it reaching a state of civil peace. And that's why I talk about the forever war and the unending conflict with itself.
Just over here, the gentleman in the blue.
My name's David. Given Biden's age and you flagged the issues around that, and the fact that they had 4 years to possibly organise a succession strategy, why didn't the Democrats organise a succession strategy?
Given they've had 4 years?
I think this one's going to be a really interesting one for historians. And let me sort of weigh in early. I think Biden did too well at 2 critical junctures in terms of sort of doing the old tap on the shoulder and saying, Joe, it's time to put your aviators on, jump in your Corvette, and drive off into the sunset. The first time he arguably did too well is in the midterms. You know, people are expecting a red wave. People are expecting the Democrats to lose the Senate and to suffer much more serious losses in the House. And they didn't. And I think if the Democrats had had a terrible shellacking in the midterm elections, then there would have been more agitation within the Democratic Party to say to Joe, it's time to retire, we need a fresh face. You have done your job, you have performed your service, democracy has prevailed, which were the 3 words of his inaugural address. that were the ringing phrase from that. You've saved us from a Trump second term. Thank you and goodbye. But the Democrats did better than expected, so Biden stayed. I think also another time where he maybe did too well was in the State of the Union this year. Did you see it? I mean, it was extraordinary. Biden was on fire. I don't know what he had for breakfast, but they should feed it him every single day from now until the election. It was an amazing performance. And again, I think if Biden had kind of had a freeze moment or a pause moment, or he couldn't read the order queue, or he'd lost his train of thought or something like that, then maybe that would have been the moment that people tapped him on the shoulder and said, Joe, it's time to go. But he survived both of those. I guess the next test for him, obviously, is this televised debate with Donald Trump. If he has a terrible debate, maybe there'll be a tap on the shoulder, but God, they've left it late. And there is an automatic replacement. So, they've got themselves in this very difficult situation with a flawed candidate, but a very, very decent man. I mean, Biden is a good man. He's a lovely man. And, given the alternative. But yeah, I think, history might show, if Trump does win, that there were opportunities to get rid of Biden, that Biden actually did too well for them to actually be taken up.
It was often said that his empathy was what connected him with American people, particularly when there was talk about him running previously, and then when he did run, he was very good at telling the personal stories and dealing with other people's personal stories. But
and at the time of COVID, when so many people were suffering so much grief, he was a man himself who'd suffered so much grief. I mean, he lost his wife and kids early on before he entered the Senate, or in the early years of his Senate career. And then, of course, he lost his son, Beau, as well. I mean, he often talks about how it was like having his heart ripped out of his chest, this gaping wound that would never heal. And at a time of so much grieving, I mean, this guy met the moment. I mean, often it's said that, it's almost like history calls you. And he answered that call. And, I think he was the kind of guy that they needed in 2020. But, even then, he was very doddery. I remember the first time I saw Biden in action in 2020, and we just couldn't believe it, to be honest. I mean, he would literally see somebody in the front row and he'd say, oh, I knew your father or your grandfather. And he'd tell a story and it served no political point. And his campaign staff thought this was a nightmare. They'd try and introduce an order queue and he thought, oh, Biden's going to go on the order queue today. That's a relief. And then just 5 minutes before the speech, they'd wheel out the order queue again. And obviously Joe said, don't worry, I've got it. I'm going to wing it. And then you get another rambling sort of speech. And the Brits were really unkind. They used to say at the British Embassy, Biden has passed his best and his best was never that good. I thought that was really kind of British sneering, really. But he wasn't that good in 2020. And of course, because of COVID, he could kind of hide away in his basement for a long time. He's not going to have that luxury this time. And, one freeze moment, one fall, one stumble, it could be enough to lose an election.
Just here.
Hamish asked you, how could it be, given all we know about Trump, how so many people could still vote for Trump? The other question is, given that all of America knows about Trump, including those who are deadly opposed to Trump, but who would otherwise vote for Biden, are now abandoning Biden, whether it's because he's too old, or more importantly, more recently, in the last 6 months, because of his stand on Israel, and how significant that could be for the outcome of the election, where you have non-compulsory voting and a whole bunch of would-be Democrat voters just don't turn up.
Yeah, that's
sorry, just repeating it for the live stream. Sorry, it sounds rude. The stand on Israel being that Biden's taken, how will that impact the election?
Yeah, look, there's so many different moving parts in this election, and certainly for a lot of Democratic voters, what happened on October the 7th and afterwards is more important for them than what happened on January the 6th. Biden hopes people will be reminded of Trump's role on January the 6th and that will win in the election. They don't want an American dictator. But an overriding issue for many Americans is Biden's support for Netanyahu. And that is really problematic, not just amongst those student protesters who have been amassing on America's campuses, but more specifically for Arab Americans. And Arab Americans tend to live in these states that are so vitally important to this election. Michigan's a key one. There's a lot of Arab Americans in a place called Dearborn, for instance. And, you know, Michigan is a must-win for Biden. If Biden doesn't win Michigan, then it's going to be really hard for him to win the election. And making it more difficult for him to win Michigan is the weakness now of Arab American support, which is almost exclusively Democrat. You know, it's not like they're going to vote for Trump. I mean, Trump tried to institute a Muslim ban if they're not going to vote in a system that doesn't have compulsory voting. And yeah, that's a real problem. There's so many moving parts in this election. What effect is Robert Kennedy going to have on the race? What effect is Roe versus Wade going to have on the race? There are so many things that could happen that we can't foresee at the moment. Some sort of disaster, some sort of, like I say, Biden falling over, tripping over, falling off his bike. You know, we just don't know what's going to happen. And anybody who predicts what's going to happen, frankly, isn't worth listening to. And any journalist should bear in mind that we are correspondents and we are not clairvoyants.
Yeah.
We cannot predict the future with any certainty.
We don't travel with a crystal ball. There's a question at the back with the man in the scarf.
Thank you. Joe Atkins is my name, from Bellman. We've read about Trump this time round, the Republicans being much more organised, and they worked out how they're going to clear out the swamp in Washington, and they've got all the replacements lined up. There is one arm of the US public machinery which would not really be amenable to that, and which takes its oath to the Constitution very seriously, and that's the US military. How do you think this is going to play out if Trump's re-elected?
So, Nick, the role of the US military if Trump is re-elected?
When I spoke about the grown-ups in the room that were around last time, it included the senior military leadership at the Pentagon. You know, Mark Milley greatly regretted, he was the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. You remember the Battle of Lafayette Square, where Trump sort of cleared the square outside the White House of protesters so that he could stage this ridiculous photo op. It was during the George Floyd protests, and he held up that Bible in front of the church that had been sort of had a little bit of vandalism. And, you know, Milley appeared with his combat fatigues. He hugely regretted the optics of all that. And it's worrying who Trump could put as defense secretary. It's worrying who Trump could put as the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, and who Trump could put all across the military. You know, what was chilling, I covered the Biden inaugural. You know, Washington that day became a garrison town. There were 35,000 troops put into Washington to make sure that American didn't fight American. I mean, it was just such a depressing thought. And they even used the terminology that had been used in the Iraq War. They called it the Green Zone. That was terminology that came from the Iraq War and Baghdad. And what was worrying that day was that the Pentagon felt the need to put out a statement that said, your first loyalty is not to the President of the United States, which on the morning of Joe Biden's inauguration was Donald Trump. Your first duty is to the Constitution. They felt the need to make that statement. There were a few dozen soldiers that got removed from active duty that day because it was discovered they had far-right leanings and were sympathetic towards what happened on January the 6th. And that really is a worry. If you look at the profile of people who ransacked the Capitol on January the 6th, I mean, it had a lot of surprisingly middle-class and affluent people, educated people, and there were a lot of sort of law enforcement people, a lot of former military people, some former special forces people, part of these militia groups. And yeah, that really is a worry, actually, because there is a lot of support for Trump within the law enforcement community, and a lot of support for Trump within the military community as well.
All right, one more question. I think I can't see who it is. There, yep, just over here.
Catherine Martin, a question for both of you. As former foreign correspondents, have there been any moments in the last couple of days where you thought, oh wow, I really wish I was in XYZ city covering ABC?
No.
I mean, one of the interesting things, I left America 3 years ago and I haven't been back. And it's the first time in my adult life that I've spent more than a year out of the States. And that's kind of heartbreaking for me. I love America. Everything I write about America comes from a place of great love and affection. You know, I told you earlier, America transformed me. I mean, it sort of set up the life that I've had. And I've had no great yearning to go back. And I write about this at the end of the book. I mean, the final chapter is this sort of melancholic goodbye to America and how we didn't look back when we were driving towards the airport. But I did want to be there on Friday. I really did. We used to have an apartment which had fantastic views of Manhattan, and we could actually look at the courthouse. And I remember in my final weeks in America, I thought, am I going to see Trump arraigned? It was the one story I wanted to cover before I left. I really wanted to see Trump arraigned. I really wanted to see him at that courthouse in New York, because I knew that was where it would be. And yeah, I did want to be there on Friday morning. But you know what I did on Friday morning? I then went down to Bondi. And I thought, do you know what?
Yeah.
I'm really glad I'm in Australia.
Do you like being in... Go on, give him the applause. You know your audience, Nick. You're not going to say that on Morning Joe on NBC later this week, are you?
Absolutely. I miss America like crazy. I want to come back.
I mean, do you think you can expel all of that foreign correspondent instinct from you? I think it's something that journalists talk about a lot. And it's a very different way of being here.
Oh, look, I think once you're off the hamster wheel, once you're off that 24/7, always on call, always have to have a bag ready, always have to be prepared to dash to an airport. I think once you've stopped doing that, it's really hard to get on it. Trump wasn't 24/7, by the way. It felt like 25/8. I mean, it was nuts. You know, sometimes you'd be lying in bed and you just pick up your phone just to make sure Trump hadn't tweeted anything crazy. And he'd say something like, Nigel Farage should be the British ambassador. And it was literally like drinking Red Bull from a fire hydrant. You wouldn't be able to sleep for the next 4 or 5 hours. And I really don't miss that, actually. I mean, you're kind of you do it in a brilliant way, I think, which is not all the time, but...
Well, it's a very addictive way of life, but I think probably not good for you.
It is addictive, but I think once you kick the habit, you can go cold turkey. And, you know, there hasn't been... I was never a person, for instance, that found it thrilling to be in war zones. I actually found war zones terrifying. I really did. I'm not going to kid you on that. I was worried. I didn't... You know, a lot of people are adrenaline junkies who love that stuff, right? Maybe you are. But I wasn't. But I went there because it was, you know, often the most dangerous places, the most interesting places, right? I mean, that's why we go there. It's out of curiosity for me, not out of a sense of thrill-seeking. But no, I don't miss that. And, you know, I've got a beautiful wife now and 3 beautiful kids. And, you know, I know that going to places like that, you know, jeopardizes that. So, yeah, no, I don't miss it.
All right. I strongly encourage you to buy the book. You can do that at the back of the room. Would you please put your hands together for the wonderful Nick Bryant?
Thank you so much for coming along. It's been a real privilege. Thank you.
And also to the audience, thank you for your wonderful questions.